Hello, I'm Bruce.
Hi, I'm Aditya.
We are the Risky Scientists. I teach risk management at the University of San Diego.
I study physics and data science at Harvard.
Right. And this week we are doing our Risky Wrinkle on manners and health. So Aditya, why are we thinking about this?
Well, Bruce, I think it's a topic that's been on my mind for quite some time now, and it's exacerbated by the COVID crisis and the evolution of the pandemic as well. And we're seeing debates about things like masks. We're seeing debates now about the importance of social distancing, about the importance of making sure that we don't spread our germs to each other. And you might think of all of these things as high-level epidemiological principles, and sure, you might be right, but I think they're also just things that you would do if you were mannerful and cared about your fellow humans. And so I think it's important to bring up the notion that good personal practices, which I guess is how I'm thinking about manners now, and you might have a different perspective of it. Good personal practices that we agree upon as a society can do a lot towards reducing the spread of these viruses, saving lives, and improving our chances of economic recovery as well.
Yeah. So let's set some parameters here. So actually, I have been concerned about the decline of manners and its effect on health for some time. So I've had discussions with sociologists and so forth at UC Berkeley when we were both there. So let's set some parameters just to anchor the audience in why manners matter to health. So you can think of some really simple examples, like sneezing into your arm, which is actually the recommended way of doing it is not just sneezing into your hand or a handkerchief, but all the way into the crook of your arm. That is a manner that will help to control the spread of disease. Covering your cough, not shouting in somebody's face.
Right.
That's good manners. Washing your hands before you shake somebody's hand. Cleaning up after yourself in a public restroom. These are good manners which are good for public health. And I'm pleased that we're doing this Risky Wrinkle because I don't think there's enough. I actually don't think I've seen any public discourse about the role of manners. There are a lot of the current disputes about whether we should wear face masks or not. Those disputes tend to be about whether face masks really work or whether they have disadvantages or, such as maybe they help with health, the kinetic parts of health transmission, but maybe they're bad for social interaction. Maybe they're bad for even mental health because of limitations on social interaction, say. But nobody's really talking about the manners of wearing face masks. And we should say, I'll give another parameter. So we're both in California, but we're in different cities. Now, California, I think it's fair to say, has had the earliest and the strictest lockdown in the United States. I think I'm correct about that.
Probably, I think definitely the earliest. Probably, I think New York during peak might have been more strict.
Was that New York City or New York State though?
Probably California had the I don't want to be quoted on this, but I'm guessing it probably had the strongest state.
Well, it doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter for the point. So, I mean, so California's just escalated its lockdown in certain senses. One sense being it's mandated the wearing of face masks in public, which in theory means not just when you enter a business. So the old justification was if you enter a shop or an enclosed space, that's a riskier place for your bodily fluids, aerosolized mucus, and thence the germs to be circulating. If you were outside, you weren't required to wear a face mask. But in theory, in public, you could be walking down a crowded sidewalk in an urban area, and the regulation means you should be wearing a face mask. Now, even though California is very strict on this, one of the strictest states in the United States, and has very popular compliance, so there are other states like Michigan where you see much more public protest against lockdown. California, there isn't that much protest.
Well, I think in the city where I'm based now, there's quite a bit actually.
So it's some cities, but there's a lot of non-compliance.
Yes.
So in the city where I am, San Diego, I notice a lot of people are not wearing face masks even when they go in stores, and there's a sort of dilemma for the store owner because they want the business.
Right.
So they're not necessarily asking, can you please pull your face mask up?
Yeah.
We might think, well, okay, these manners have no relevance here because these are the norms we just have to work around. So if people, it's a regulatory or legal thing, but it's not. So good. I'm going to give this contrast with Japan. So Japan has the lowest per capita rate of COVID-19 fatalities of any of the developed world countries. That's not because they were well prepared for the pandemic. They did not have testing and tracking ready like South Korea did. They did not have a national stockpile of PPE, personal protective equipment. They, like all the Western countries that really struggled, like Britain, they had shortages and they weren't prepared and they were late to decide what they were going to do, but they've had the lowest rate of deaths in all the developed countries. And the best explanation for that, and then the Japanese Prime Minister has aired this explanation, is that Japanese are more mannered. And he's had some pushback against this because, maybe that sounds xenophobic or self-interested to say so. But it certainly makes sense. It's a theory that certainly makes sense. That Japanese have held on to old-fashioned norms like social distance. They social distance anyway, and they have high rates of using face masks in public. One reason being to protect against pollution.
Yeah.
And they're not in the habit of public kissing and public handshaking. So those are norms. I think then they have very strict expectations of compliance with those norms, so they will make an issue of the manners, or if you are coughing in public in an unsafe way. So I'm confused why manners are not being discussed. I mean, if Japanese manners make the difference between the lowest rate of fatalities to COVID-19 in the developed world versus countries like Britain and the United States, the two highest, the most lethal places to be from COVID-19, if manners make the difference, if that's the only thing, right, because we've held everything else constant, shortage of PPE, lateness to enact any policy, unprepared to test and trace, if manners make all the difference, why aren't we discussing this in the public?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. And it seems like I don't, I'm at a loss really to understand why manners is so out of the limelight. And some people might say, well, okay, look, let's say that manners conflicts with freedom. And I don't think it does at all. There's a sense in which, sure, asking anything of anybody is a conflict with absolute freedom. So if I say that you should obey the speed limit, or you should not kill somebody, or you should not do any of these things, that could be seen as a conflict with freedom. But there are things that we agree upon, and it seems like what is fundamentally lacking is that there seems to be a lack of care that is being displayed about our fellow citizens. And I don't mean this.
It's sort of contradictory, though. That lack of care is contradictory. So people have a lot of care about their own health, but they don't apply the same standards that they expect for themselves to protect themselves. So it's sort of a fundamental attribution error writ large here.
Seeing that a lot with the arguments against masks lately that concern me, because a lot of the arguments against and here I'm talking mostly about cloth masks or surgical masks, not fully protective or 95% protective N95 masks or anything like that. And it seems like a lot of people are arguing, well, oh, look, these masks may allow air to come inside. And it's, sure, it's not a complete protection, but when everybody engages in a behavior that is mutually respectful, you see exponential benefits. So, I mean, we've been talking about these sort of these mathematical, the ways that things blow up and the way that one person can spread something to another person, and that's exactly why manners matters. Is because if one person is doing it, it's probably not a huge deal. But if everybody thinks like that, now you have a major problem. And there's other examples of this, right? I'm really excited to see that parks are starting to reopen, but just from personal experience, you visit the park and people are, rather than enjoying nature, I find that people are often engaging in very unmannered behavior, littering, for example. And oftentimes these waste products are very likely to be contaminated, especially if you take your mask off and you throw it on the street. I mean, that's pretty appalling.
Yeah. Well, so I think it's clearer in the British case. So Britain has had a cold summer and it's just having a heat wave. And people are officially, nominally, they're still in lockdown, but there's mass disobedience, non-compliance. There's mass non-compliance with lockdown. People are flooding to the beaches and the parks. And you could say, well, that's understandable. They want to get out of lockdown. But the ill manners are still not necessary. So it may be necessary that people need to get out. It's not necessary that people need to be ill mannered. So there's lots of reporting, and we will post the links. Yeah. That, I mean, people are partying, so they're not social distancing. They're crowding onto the beaches, crowding into the parks. And then they're littering and they're urinating in public, essentially. I mean, that's another health concern, right? Urinating and defecating outside of the sewage system. That's now, those are also vectors for the spread of disease. And I'm shocked by this, because this is not necessary to your non-compliance with a lockdown. That's one problem, and you know, the police and then the government has to manage non-compliance. That may mean one escape from that is you end lockdown because you can't enforce it. Yeah. But we're still going to be left with this manners problem, because even if we sort of come out of lockdown and then people don't feel, I've got to escape and do something crazy and take risks, we're still left with a society which has lower manners, which means the next time there's a pandemic, that society, an ill-mannered society, is going to be riskier than a mannered society. Japan has proved that versus places like Britain.
I think there's lots of examples of where I really want to push back against this notion that manners are a complete restriction of freedom. And that, yes, as long as we accept that we all live in society, that oftentimes manners can grant you more freedom. And I think I want to use Germany's Autobahn as an example. From all reports, I mean, yes, so let's make it clear. The entire Autobahn is not de-restricted. And in fact, the Autobahn is very highly policed inside of cities and inside of villages. So there's a sense in which when you are in a location where there is significant risk for others, you really don't want to be speeding through a tiny city at 190 miles per hour. But once you're out into the countryside, there's a very high degree of compliance, like you said, with something as simple as keeping to the right lane when you're not passing. And something like that, plus training. So we should talk about training, right? How do you practice manners? But when these manners are practiced, Germany has an incredibly low automotive fatality rate. And if you think about it, a very high degree of freedom to go as fast as you like and to make the judgments that you think are safe, not only for yourself, but for your fellow drivers.
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to rephrase what you're talking about just to make this clearer, because it's conditional freedom, right? So the freedom you're talking about is the freedom to drive without a speed limit on the German Autobahns, but it's highly conditional. So the only way those sorts of freedoms work, because they're freedoms that they can have horrendous public health consequences. So if you are a bad driver and you're driving at higher speed, you're exacerbating the risk of your bad driving. Right. I think there's two conditions on extending freedoms. If you don't enforce a law on reckless driving, your freedom to drive at any speed is going to be very risky. Right? So, and then there's the training part, which you mentioned. Now, the training part, I think, should be one consequence of the enforcement part. So if people understand that if you are reckless with your freedoms, you're going to lose your freedoms, they are being trained. The consequences of training people to behave that way. But I think we still need to train the general virtue of manners, and I don't think I don't think that's in the discourse. The virtue of manners is not in the discourse, because the discourse is perversely about individual freedoms, or the individual freedoms, I think, in a selfish way instead of a collectively responsible way.
Absolutely.
And there's the contradictions in the discourse on this. So people will talk about, this is good for society if we take away your property rights.
Yeah.
Let's say so the homeless should be able to squat on private property because they're in need. Yeah, they are in need, but you're taking away other people's rights in order to grant the homeless freedoms to squat where they want. So there are these contradictions, which are often phrased as human rights. And let me talk as a political scientist. A lot of these freedoms are phrased as human rights, and then you can't challenge human rights. Well, they're human rights. That's the argument. Well, human rights are very rarely actually unambiguous. They're very rarely legally defined, and they're very rarely without consequence for other people's rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that manners is so. I mean, I think the point you're bringing up is that compromise is part of human rights, and there's a sense in which manners are developed out of, I think, virtues that most people would think of as valuable. But having this virtue doesn't mean that the virtue gives you an unalienable right to do whatever you want. So I'm talking about virtues like freedom. I think it's a term that's thrown about so much that I think it's incredibly important, and I would love to be able to do whatever I would like to do, so long as it's mannered and so long as it's considerate to other people. And there's a sense in which freedom is very much misused. And perhaps masks are a fantastic example of where the costs are often misrepresented, and the costs of policing, I think, are misrepresented. The cost of wearing a mask. So there's lots of arguments about why you shouldn't wear a mask. That, for example, you might be, the latest one I've heard is you might be breathing in your own air. And then you think about it for a moment and you say, well, maybe you might be breathing in your own air a little bit more, but would you really want to wipe somebody else's face with your dirty napkin when you go out to dinner? No, you would wipe your own face with your own dirty napkin. So there's a sense in which that doesn't make any sense, because what we want is a well-mannered society in which we are responsible both for ourselves, and in being responsible for our own conduct, we can be more responsible for social well-being and general health.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, just to clarify how individual manners can be liberating for society as a whole. So if people socially distance, they suppress their coughs and their sneezes, we're going to have a healthier society, and we're less likely to be locked down.
Yeah.
So that's in everybody's interest. So there's a collective interest in individual manners. However, there's a collective action problem, is that the individual has incentives to cheat. So they don't want to invest in the face mask. They don't want the restrictions that are good for society as a whole, but they expect everybody else to be doing that. Now, if everybody behaves selfishly, the social norms break down. And I think that's the problem Western civilization has in general. And I don't think there's enough discussion of why norms of mannered behavior matter to help.
Yeah. And I wonder what we do about about enforcement. So I think Japan is a fantastic example, like you said, and it seems very clear to me that we shouldn't be, other than our immediate family or whoever we might be living with, et cetera, that we shouldn't be shaking hands and kissing and doing these things in public, not until the pandemic goes away. But there's an example, I think, from Japan. And then I think there's also an example for those of people. I think there's some people in, I won't name names, but in America for certain, who think that engaging in any sort of restraint is a sign of weakness. And I think for those people, I was very interested to see what, and I've been learning more about what people who work in very highly dangerous situations engage in. What sort of behaviors do they engage in? Because I think it's fair to say that during a pandemic, we're all, the act of living, the act of going to work, all of these things have increased risk. And if you look at something like a special forces team that is trying to enter a building, I think there's very strict manners on which direction you point your gun and very strict enforcement on being coordinated.
It's called muzzle discipline. Muzzle discipline, right. Yeah.
And there's a very high degree of enforcement to make sure that you're effective together in this very dangerous situation as opposed to shooting your buddy. And it feels like if that's what people are doing when they're in life and death situations, those of us who don't have to do that every day should really learn from that. And maybe there's a lesson there as well.
Yeah, well, there's a lesson there that there should be more consequences for selfish behavior.
Yeah.
But it's, I don't know what those consequences could be in a modern liberal society, because you're infringing then on people's rights to do what they want at the expense of society. So this is where I think we have a wider civilizational problem, is that now individuals generally, the expectation is they can do what they want at the expense of society. Well,
I'm not the expert. I'm not a policymaker, but coming from a scientific basis and the things that we've talked about, I'll propose a solution for you and for our readers, for our listeners to comment on. I mean, what if we tried to approach this in a manner of biggest problems to smallest problems? And what do I mean by that? I mean, in a sense in which we need to be very strict in enforcing those manners which are immediately problematic and really start to build towards that. So let's start with masks. I mean, perhaps if you're out on a hike in the middle of nowhere, and of course, if it is what your government mandates, you should still do it. I'm not advocating anything against that, but I'm saying that if you're out in the middle of nowhere and there's really no law saying that you should wear a mask, then you probably don't, and it's fine, and it's probably well-mannered not to. On the other hand, if you're at a grocery store where there are lots of people, if you're standing in line, or even if you're outside standing in line and there's a breeze blowing, these are all reasons to be thinking about, well, I should wear a mask, and maybe we can have higher degrees of enforcement, and we can offer more support for those who are trying to enforce it. I've seen there's lots of things now about people trying to berate store employees for trying to enforce mask policies, and it's really not their fault. And I think they are trying to create an environment that is mannered inside of not quite a domicile, but inside of their space that's under their control at that time. And
and to extend that, there are people advocating for a wider restoration of manners than would be justified by health alone. Mm-hmm. So social distancing is being advocated as perhaps less stressful. So we've got in the Western civilization has got in the habit of lionizing extroverts, mm-hmm. introverts, and pushing people to be more approachable and more communicative and have wider circles of acquaintances. And I think social media plays this part. So you want as many friends as you can, so you acquire wider social networks. And a lot of people are saying they prefer social distancing And there so good examples of this. Dominic Lawson, a British, has made the point. He likes the idea that barbers and hairdressers are being encouraged not to talk to their clients, right? Because they don't want to share a close range aerosolized mucus.
Right.
But he's saying it was nice when barbers and hairdressers shut up anyway, because I just, I don't want your inane conversation. I don't want the effort of making conversation when I just want you to cut my hair. And he says also about restaurants. So in Britain, restaurants, pubs, when they reopen fully, they're being encouraged to keep the music down.
Yes. Which
used to be a marketing ploy, knowing that if loud music, people talk quicker and they eat more food and they drink more. They drink quicker and they consume quicker. And the government is advising keep the music down, and then people are less likely to shout and less likely to propel their aerosolized mucus beyond the social distance requirements. So Dominic Lawson making that point that let's have quiet restaurants again. Not just for the health benefits, but this is good for society anyway, to go to quiet and social distance and reserve our intimacy or our private space, a personal space, as we say in American English. So those sorts of manners could have wider benefits. So perhaps people would be less stressed in a less socially intimate, less extrovert, less noisy society.
And I think that what you're saying also brings me to a part of the conversation that I hope we can have more of, which is the notion that one should also have a little bit of quiet time in order to bring value to a conversation. If we're always conversing and having no time, and I've often felt this, so I'm just as guilty as everybody else, right? You're always trying to keep up, and so you have to have commentary about everything. And the first thing to go is reading, or the first thing to go is listening to people, because you always have to give your advice or make the latest post. And it feels like that is very damaging. And we should be talking about that as well as part of manners, is that if we can be a little bit, I'm not advocating for stiff, reserved behavior all the time, but a little bit more thoughtful before we engage, then I think we'd have higher quality engagement with each other.
Yeah, I think that circles back to the virtues we have articulated before in science, which is humility and reflection. Time to be humble. So we don't, if we're constantly pushed to have the answer, that we're not going to have the humility. So this is a problem in academia, where academics are supposed to know everything or have opinions. Let's put it like this. Academics are supposed to have opinions on everything. And that's not the scientific tradition. The tradition is to be humble. And so I need to go find the evidence. I need to reflect on that. So we need time for reflection as scientists. And this fast pace of life and the expectation that if you don't have a position, then you must be hiding something. That's another very vicious accusation. Well, what do you hide? You need to think about it. Isn't it obvious? Isn't the consensus obvious to you? If you're a skeptic, then you must be hiding some prejudice. So that's a nice circle back, I think, that manners can give us the scientific virtues of humility and reflection.
No, that's well said. So I'm excited to have more mannered conversations with you and with everyone else as we slowly hopefully emerge and go through the troubles together, because I don't think we're out of the woods yet, but hopefully this way we can stay more connected while we suffer together.
Yeah. Mannered conversations are healthy conversations, and they're also scientific conversations.
Well said. Well, we are the Risky Scientists.
We are. Goodbye.